So we're gonna have to really talk fast, but you guys still will take as much time as you need, talking about all these different issues. I wanted to begin this morning with just a short encouragement of a passage of scripture that has been probably the most important passage of scripture in my life's calling at Mosaix, because there's so many times. You know, you're seeing the 21-year version. I've been doing this for 21 years of what God has done through Mosaix. But at year 7 or so, I thought I was the worst excuse ever of a person ever called into a ministry to build a church like Mosaix Church. There was so much messiness, so much misunderstanding, so much finger pointing, so much hurt, so much toxicity, just so much learning and growing and mistakes. And some of it was because of my own inexperience, my own immaturity, my own insecurities, you name it. It was all there. And this one passage is what let me sleep at night. Because I told you guys I was a professor for 10 years, and halfway through that, God called me into ministry. I didn't know where or when. I just was so desperate. I said, okay, I'll go anywhere you want me to go, do anything you want me to do, as long as you make it clear. And then 10 days later, I was in Arkansas doing research because I had a joint contract with a professor friend at Arkansas. We were so far behind because I was doing so much ministry, and in the process of that trip, I met the founder of the church, Mark, who painted this vision for this church for all people that hadn't even been birthed yet. And I was so consumed with this picture of a church. I'd never, ever in my life heard of a multi-ethnic church. Didn't even know it existed. Didn't know there was this church that could possibly even intentionally be multi-ethnic. But the moment I heard it, I lost sleep over it. And I couldn't stop thinking about it. And so on October 15th, it took 9 months to get us through the process of just offering us a job. They had not even been birthed. And so I had to wait for that to happen, leadership to form, then they had to offer me a job, which the job was, we think we can pay you $24,000 a year. And I was already a fully tenured professor of electrical engineering with a family of 3. And we were so convinced God wanted us in Little Rock, we were more afraid to say no than we were to say yes, because he had shown us so clearly, you said you would do anything I asked you to do, as long as you made it clear, and he made it really clear except for the money. Which a lot of times, depending on where you stand on those spectrums, that's not clear, right? But for us, it was like, okay, let's just go in faith. And so on October the 15th, I left North Idaho as a professor of electrical engineering with 0 full-time ministry experience, and drove 4 days across the country in this god-awful looking purple minivan with 3 little screaming girls, and ended up in downtown urban Little Rock pastoring a multi-ethnic church on October 19th. And those 4 days were my 4 days of training. And the first 7 years were like, the best picture I can describe it is like having weights tied onto the bottom of your feet and throwing you out into the deep end of a pool and say, now go teach everybody else how to swim. That's the way it felt for 7 years. And this passage of scripture is what kept me able to sleep well at night. And I want to encourage all of you all, because if God uses you in the same way he's used me, there will be many nights where you're wondering, why am I doing this? Yeah, there's going to be many nights where you're going, is this really worth it? And you have to have reasons beyond feeling good about yourself. You have to have reasons beyond, it's the cool thing to do. You have to be absolutely 100% confident that God has asked you to do this. Okay? This is Paul talking to his young protege Timothy. That's why I love Timothy, the letters to Timothy, because they're not written to a church. They're written to a specific person. And this is the last letter of Paul's life, and he's trying to get young Timothy to take on the calling that he had to further the growth of the churches to all those people, them, right? And so look at what he says. Don't be ashamed of me, of the testimony about our Lord, nor of me his prisoner, because Paul is in chains at this moment. He's beheaded after this letter. But share in suffering for the gospel of the power of God, who saved us and called us to a holy calling. And so he's encouraging Timothy, if you're going to join this calling, expect some suffering. This is where, and the part that I want all of you to get to just impress and embed in your thinking is, I have to learn to live comfortably in the state of misunderstanding. Okay? Because that's what this space is. In order for very different kinds of people to come together and be unified across all these divides, there's going to be a time where there's great misunderstanding. And you have to be the one that sticks in the middle of that misunderstanding, can live in it, and keep trying to draw people together. Okay? That's part of the suffering, because they're going to point fingers. And they'll go, what? You're the last reason. You're the, you betrayed me, or you did all of this stuff because you're just understanding who all these people are. And it's a hard, hard place to be. That's one of the biggest growth areas of the first 7 years of ministry, is just learning how to be comfortable in that. And there's many, many sleepless nights. But look at how Paul terms this holy calling, that is a very specific calling to him, to the Gentiles, to the other, to them. And the way he's trying to convince Timothy to join him, he describes the calling, and it's not because of our works. Okay, so it's not because I had an electrical engineering degree, right? I drove across the country thinking, God's going to use me to change the world. And when I got there, it was like, oh my goodness, what have I gotten myself into? It was like everything I thought about myself as a leader, as a person, as a spiritual person was just thrown out the window. You should have seen my first sermon to Mosaix Church, because it came from a highly academic setting. It was a lot like, Research Triangle, because Moscow and Pullman are two big universities, 8 miles apart. So it's just full of academics. And my first sermon at Mosaix was 2 full pages, about 40 fill in the blanks, and I preached, and after I got done, everybody looked at me like, oh my gosh, we just moved this man 2,000 miles with his family, and this is what it was like everybody's head was blown backwards and all this stuff. And so I knew it wasn't because of who I was that he called me. It had nothing to do with what I could do, right? And instead, it has to do because of his purpose and his grace. And that means, when was that given? He gave it to us in Christ Jesus before the ages began. So how much of the calling has to do with who you are? 0. How much of it has to do with who your parents are? 0. How much of it has to do with where you went to school? None. How much money you have? 0. See, before he said, let there be light, he wrote the story. And the story has you in it. A very specific story. And after he wrote the story from let there be light to Revelation 7 and beyond, he closed the book, and then he said, okay, let there be light. And now we're living out the screenplay. Okay? And your job is to figure out, what did he write about me, and how can I live this out? And so, It all happened before time began. It all has very little to do with you. He's asked you to do something he knows you cannot do. Does that make sense? First of all, why would he ask you to do something if he knew you could do it? Would he ever do that? I think the answer is no. Because it confuses the matter. If he said, hey, Harry, I want to call you from electrical engineering to pastor of Mosaix Church, and all you got to do to succeed and fulfill your calling is design a 3-stage amplifier. I'm like, hey, I could do that. Look at God, right? No. Because people would go, didn't you have 10 years of training at Georgia Tech to do that? No, it's like, he asked me specifically to do something he knew I was not prepared to do, not experienced to do, not mature enough to do. There were so many mistakes I made in those early days. It was comical and painful. And I was a super people pleaser. And you know how God beat the people pleaser out of me? Is he made it impossible for me to fulfill my calling and please the people I wanted to please the most. And that was the most painful process I've ever been through in my life, you know, and it still is to this day the hardest lesson I've learned and the most important lesson I've ever learned, all at the same time. So he did it before time began, and it's now been manifested through the appearing of Christ, who abolished death and brought life and immortality to light through the gospel, and from which I was appointed a preacher, apostle, and teacher, which is why I suffer as I do. So Paul, remember, before he came to Christ, was already fully degreed. He was the Hebrew of Hebrews. He was a Pharisee of Pharisees. He had all the credentials needed, but it wasn't until after he fulfilled his call, started living out his call, that he was actually appointed an apostle. It took him 18 years from the point he came to Christ to the point of where he was fully recognized as an apostle. And so all the appointments came in light of the call, not before. Okay? And so that's why I always just say this: God doesn't call the qualified. He qualifies the called. And so in the midst of those hard times, because I can't tell you the number of times in those early days, people looked at me and said, you know, Harry, you're as racist as the guy I just worked for. And the first time that happened, devastating, right? There's a self-righteousness part of me that goes, how dare you? I quit my job and I moved my family 2000, you know. There's all of that comes up. And that's why I'm saying this stuff is expensive, because it costs you your pride. You have to be willing to lay all of that junk down for the sake of the gospel, for the sake of building the kingdom, for the sake of fulfilling your own calling. Okay? So, remind each other of that when things get hard. Because it's never clean. Remember the stories, they're like red. There's a lot of stories that are very dissatisfying. There will be a lot of mistakes along the way, and you just have to trust that God knows that, and it's according to His grace, not your worst critic's grace, not your own grace. Because you can be your own worst critic. Anybody like that in the room? Nobody ever has to tell you when you do bad, because you're the one that's always jumping on yourself. You know what? You have to learn to extend grace even to yourself, especially for things like this. So, let me pray for you, and then we'll pick back up on where we started. So, Lord, I pray you would solidify in every person what it is you have in mind for them for this church and a time for such as this. I pray you would give them the willingness to walk in those very, very difficult, uncomfortable, soul-wrenching, tearful, dark nights where there's so much pain and hurt, and times where they don't understand and people misunderstanding, and there's just lots of that going on. And somehow out of that they would keep living humbly, sincerely before you, that they would keep trusting you and hoping for a better day, and that you would work deeply in their own lives for your glory and only for your glory, and that you would use each other to encourage one another, and that one day they could turn back and go, oh man, that was the hardest thing we ever did, but it was the most amazing thing I've ever seen God do in my life. And so we thank you. I pray you'd give us a great, great day. Make it full of wonder and glorious, full of awe of who you are and your creation. Help us to figure out answers to deep and troubling questions, and just to understand each other and know how to love one another. And we thank you and we pray it in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen.
All right. Yesterday, who was not here last night? So there's like 3 or 4 of you. Okay. So yesterday we started with a lot of theology and just God's, and I don't know if you can go back. I recommended a book, which is Mark DeMaz's book. And if you read the first third of that, that really is, you all should really memorize that first third of the book. It is so important to making sure that you can articulate to others why we're doing what we're doing, why this is so important, why the Bible speaks about it, how Paul's mission, all that stuff about Paul, and it's all there. Okay, so read over that. Then we started talking about cultural values. And the first one we did was the big one, which was individualism, collectivism, and it's the question that we answered was, how do you define family? So we lined everybody up, and we had people over here, and Anthony and Camille were like, yeah, family is anybody that has a meal with me. And then on this end, we had high individualists that were like, yeah, my family is who's living under my roof. It's nuclear. And we saw that there was need for both of those perspectives in the body of Christ, and how they both played out uniquely, both potentially godly and ungodly, and the way there was culture clashes that could turn into personal offenses. One thing I didn't say last night was, how does God define family? What is it? Yeah, we celebrate it every time we gather. What is it?
Community.
Yeah, it's the blood of Christ. It's communion, right? And so when we celebrate communion at Mosaix, we make people come forward, and it's a great visual reminder of who we are, because you have this great diverse group just lining up, all coming forward to receive the elements, the body and the blood of Christ. And every time, if I'm leading it, I almost always say, when I get to the blood, it's like, this is what binds us together. This is what makes us family, right? It's not just having a meal, and it's not just because I'm legally responsible. It's because of what Christ did on our behalf, right? That brings family to a whole new perspective. And what I'll say a lot of times during that time is, every Sunday we gather and we do this is a family reunion. And you know what? There's people in this room that are like that uncle you can't stand. But despite the fact that you can't stand them, you're related to them whether or not you want to be or not, because of what Christ did for both of you. Right? So that's one of the great unifying ways that you can continue to use the blood of Christ to bring people together and help them understand, whether or not I disagree or not, whether they get on my nerves or not, whether I understand their political views or not, they're family. Brings it all into a different perspective. And then we moved on into power distance, right? And so this was on how you make decisions, and the fact that there's, high power people that expect to make a decision and expect you just to respect it, and there's others that are expecting you to speak in and question it. And that's pretty much where we ended up, okay? And I want us to continue on because we got a lot to talk about, and I'll make you stand and do some of these other ones here in a minute. But let's do a couple of them where we're not necessarily standing. One thing about the power distance that we did talk about is the fact that, this is not just about the way you make decisions, but about the power related to the decision making, okay, and who has the power and the authority. And we ended up defining what authority is from a Christ-like point of view, and the fact that if you have power distance, even in your groups, this is where you got to be careful. If you are ministering and have people in your groups that are very high power distance and you're low power distance as a group leader, and you're just dreaming out loud, you need to be careful about that. Because if the high power distance people think you're the one in charge and you're just dreaming, you say, what would be really nice one day is if we could, we could have group out at the park. And then the high power distance people are going to, well, he's the leader, we're having group out at the park next time. Didn't you hear that? That's what he said. And then they start planning the group at the park. And then there's a lot of confusion, like, why are we having the group at the park? Well, you're the one that said it. I can't tell you the number of times things like that have happened to me where I'm just dreaming out loud because I'm trying to get input, I'm just thinking about ideas, and the high power distance people are going, Pastor's spoken. We gotta have a new ministry, and they get all stressed out and start working towards it, and like, I never said we're gonna do that. And they're like, that's what you said in the last meeting. I said, no, we were just dreaming about that. I didn't say it. Well, it came out of your words, you're the pastor. And so be careful about all of that because it's very real. So, and I was thinking about this question, because think about small groups from a collectivistic point of view. What would you do if, say, a family from Central America came to visit the church, they liked what they saw, they got invited to your small group, and they show up to your small group with 4 kids? What are you going to say? What would you say?
Playroom's over there.
Yeah, but then what if they go, well, where are all the other kids? What would you say?
You brought them.
Yeah, yeah. But what if, but there's some cultures where small groups, or if you expect small groups to happen without kids, that's just a foreign concept. Completely foreign. At Mosaix, especially in the Hispanic part of our church, you know what a small group is? About 50 people. And I'm not exaggerating. And there's probably 12 or 15 adults and probably about 25 kids, all having a meal, screaming, chaos. And somewhere in there is a little discussion and encouragement, and it starts when the last person gets there, and it ends when the last person leaves. Sometimes it's supposed to start at 6, doesn't start till 7:30. It's supposed to end at 8, doesn't end till 10:30. That's just different perspectives on what family is and the way it plays itself out in the church. Another one is like, what if somebody says, oh, well, you're supposed to get childcare for your kids. And they say, well, how am I going to pay for that? So you're telling me a small group is going to cost me $40 a week in childcare when I'm already putting my kids in daycare all day? Those are all the kinds of considerations that, as you think about the different perspectives and views, that greatly shape the practicalities, the forms of ministry. And so that's why, as we go through all this, try to go from the way people think down to the way you do things, because that's the form. But remember how we define culture is the way we do things around here. And so if you can shape the way you do ministry, you can shape culture. Okay? All right, so some things to consider, and they're not easy answers. You know, for us, when we do small groups, they're all over the place. And they're, a lot of times, some of them are really big, some of them are really small, some of them are what you would consider very traditional small groups in this church. Some of them look nothing like that. You know, some of them are working next to each other, some always include kids, some always include a meal, some don't. On and on it goes. All right, so let's look at the next cultural value, which is how comfortable are we in the midst of uncertainty? Okay? This is called uncertainty avoidance. And this is like the planners with high predictability, which is high uncertainty avoidance. I mean, you do everything you can to avoid uncertainty. And those of you in the room are, let me hear the amens from those that are the planners, right? The ones they're the ones that like to plan things out. They have a list that is very predictable, and they know it's just well planned and thought out. And then you have the people, look at the icon on the left part of the screen. The guy jumps off the cliff and is hoping there's somebody going to be there to land, to catch him when he jumps off, right? They're the ones that are the go with the flow people. They like figuring that out as we go. They're the ones that are very comfortable building an airplane while you fly it. Right? There's a lot more risk in that one, right? Now, which one's good and which one's bad? Neither one, right? They both have their purposes, their strengths, and their weaknesses, and there's also clash. You guys are more on the planning side, which isn't necessarily surprising. Because anytime you're organizing large numbers of people, especially higher level leaders, you start moving towards planning. You have to, right? It's just part of the practicalities of logistics. However, what is somebody that's like, anybody want to say who the 18 is? Who's on the low end of uncertainty here? Who's low uncertainty? So we have 2 or 3. Okay. Yeah. So the ones that aren't necessarily super rigid in their planning, but are a lot more go with the flow, when do you feel like the strengths of them would show up? How should you utilize somebody like that on your teams?
When things don't go as planned, you need somebody to not freak out about it.
Yeah. Yeah, how many times do things go not as planned? All the time. And if you have somebody super high uncertainty, what happens when that happens? They fall apart many times, right? And what are the people down here saying?
Chill out.
Chill out, man. God has got this. It'll all work out in His own due time. And there's other people that are like, oh, quick, that didn't work. Let's figure out something else to do. Maybe we could try this. And they save the day by being the person that in the moment can innovate, be flexible, and find new ways to do something, but actually work out better than what you planned. Okay, I'm actually like about the 18, so I'm on the low uncertainty side. So is the founder of the church, Mark DeMoss. We both are super low uncertainty. You know what that meant for the first 5 years of the church? Utter sheer chaos. We were living, out of a closet. We were renting space, moving church in every Sunday. It took 2.5 hours of labor. Had to set up the sound system from scratch, chairs, you name it. And about 20 minutes before service started, Mark and I would look at each other and go, what are we doing today? And so we'd get a napkin and he goes, okay, here's what we'll do. We got the band's going to do 2 songs. Why don't you come and do announcements? I'll do this, and then we'll do. And it was all done on the back of a napkin 30 minutes before church started. You can only grow a church so far using that method, I can tell you. And it wasn't until this man walked in one time, he was like, I could help you guys with your planning. Why don't I take some time off? I'll come in on a Monday. we'll put the next 3 services on a spreadsheet. And we'll spend an hour planning on Mondays for the next 3 weeks. And I'm going, you can do that? Seriously. And it just revolutionized the church and where we were at the time. Right? And you can see now, if we did our staff would pretty much be where you guys are now. We've hired a lot of good planning people. The most important one is the financial guy. He is so uber planned. He's the guy that he can't go home until he's balanced every one of the church's account to the penny. And there's like 8 of them. And he's just that kind. And thank God, because I don't think I've balanced a checkbook since I was 21. You know, I mean, it's like, and he has single-handedly instilled confidence in the church's body that when they give money, every penny is tracked from the moment it comes in the door until the moment it's spent. So do we need him? Absolutely. Is Raphael super flexible? Not necessarily, right? He's very much in his eye. He's an industrial engineer, or former industrial engineer. He'll sit in his office, and if you walked in, knock on his door, he'll just look up and go, and I'll say something like, hey, Raphael, do you remember when we had that work done on the parking lot 3 years ago? Yeah? Do you remember what contractor we used? And he'll go, pull out his filing cabinet, pull out a notebook, laminated sheets, pull out this sheet and go, here it is. Thank you so much. 'Cause that thing would be in the trash if it were up to me, right? but then he'll go, anything else? No, thank you. And I'd like, go like this. But then there's people on our church who are like super gregarious ministry types, right? And they're like, you got to do something about Raphael. I go, how come? He is just so impersonal. And I go, is there anybody else on our staff that can reconcile 8 accounts to the penny every day and not feel like they can go home until they can do it, until it's done? Have you ever balanced your checkbook? No. Well, then leave him alone. Let him do his job. He's fulfilling a very vital role for us. And unless you can find somebody that can do that and be uber personal and flexible, then bring me that person. Until then, leave them alone. Yeah. And so those are the kinds of things as you deal with people that are not like you.
So those are the 2 extremes.
Yeah.
What about the ones who are like right in the middle?
Yeah, so what do you think the purposes are for people who are in the middle? What is their role?
Balancing it out.
Yeah, many times it is balancing out and understanding. You understand both. Are you right in the middle?
I'm right in the
So you know exactly what that feels like, right?
Yeah.
And how does it manifest itself when you're in a group setting and say,
If nobody can pick a restaurant, I'm generally the one to pick the restaurant. But then I can also recognize, like, you know, it's not really that, you know, we can be laid back about this and we can just walk downtown and find something on the way.
mm-hmm.
But that can be exhausting sometimes to kind of feel like, should I be the voice in this situation, or should I step back and let those high achieving individuals who maybe have more experience than me take over?
Yeah, and so but in the planning process, and not necessarily in the decision-making process of it all, but in the planning of, you know, whatever you're doing, if you're in the middle and you see the recognition, you see and recognize, no, we've got to plan up to a point. But there's a point where you're over-planning. You know, that's where you would be able to recognize that. And on the other end, you see where if you're not a planner, it can approach being irresponsible, right? Oh, don't worry. Yeah, we got 500 people coming tomorrow. It'll work out. Don't freak out. And we're like, you don't even have a room set up yet? So that's where, again, there's strengths, weaknesses, potential for irresponsibility, offense on both ends, and you just have to be careful how you do it. This was one of your highest conflicts or potential for conflicts in this group. Yeah.
As an 18, I would say that it is possible to like still go with the flow, but recognize that planning is still important and relevant. So like to what you were saying about being in the middle and being someone who would very much go with the flow. In my personal life versus my professional life, if I took this, it may not be the same type of result. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like, at work, I have to be very, very more planned and things like that. So I wouldn't be as far as an 18, but in my personal life, for sure.
Yeah, and that's a great point, because remember, you answered these questions in relationship to your peers. Okay, so it's like this group, hopefully, is what you were thinking. And so, because if you're home, it's probably a different set of answers, because it's a different culture. And this culture is shaping you depending on what the expectations are within this group itself. And so that's why it's important to know how you're defining culture, how you're measuring it, so that you can therefore together shape it. Okay? Because there may be some of you who like, I don't like the way this culture has forced me to be this way. That's where it can become unhealthy, if they're forcing you to be somebody you're not. But what is healthy is if you are one way and you recognize the need for the person on the other way. Okay? All right. Yes?
Quick comment. So this is something, I'm going to credit a former coworker, Charles, on this. He basically taught me this, but I kind of fall in the middle of this one personally, and really no matter where you are, I think you can practice this skill that he taught me, which is we're basically scheduling a work task, and it involved us working with other people in a team, kind of one-on-one sort of thing, and his suggestion was, hey, let's set a time and a date, but be flexible, be understanding if that doesn't work out. So I think what you can do is, if you start with that, okay, you're being decisive, that helps with people who have the high uncertainty avoidance. They like the structure there. And then, but if you're flexible, you can say, okay, well, clearly that doesn't work for you. Let's, how can we make this work better with your schedule?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. That's a great way to help define process. Remember, if you can define processes for the whole team so that it takes into account the different ways your people are, that's a big win, because that makes everybody feel, okay, great, so now there is room for me to innovate and be creative and figure things out as we go. But we know the big things that do need to be organized will be organized. There's so many things you could talk about here. I was thinking about COVID and how uncertain things were. There were people that loved that time, even though it was highly stressful, right? Because I remember the week we shut the church down, it was like, okay, we've got to figure out an affordable way to improve our virtual online presence. And we need to have a low-cost studio here in the church that we can add to the streaming of what we already have, so that we can have online hosts and all this stuff and speak to everybody. And I'm like, oh man, that sounds so fun. Let me try it. And those are the kinds of things that it's just like, ooh, please, let me try that. And there's people that are wired that way. And so look for them. Because if you're the kind that loves to plan and are really gifted at planning, in those moments of uncertainty, you look for the low uncertainty people and say, hey, can you help me figure out how can we innovate around this? Because I'm stressed out, because this plan's not going as planned. And they'll be the ones like, ooh, I got this. Thank you so much for letting me do this. And it'll be the weight off your shoulders, and you'll see somebody else really blossom and all that.
What if you are a super planner, but you really like to try new things, and like when you're in the moment, like to be flexible? Because I feel like that's from my standpoint, that's how you're very creative.
Yeah, and in fact, it's kind of like you're both. You have preferences for one, you answer the questions, but in reality, you're probably has some very strong aspects of low uncertainty as well. And that's a good thing. You know how to move around that spectrum. And that's really, if you feel comfortable moving as far along those spectrums as you can, just to help serve others and help encourage others and put yourself in those uncomfortable places where you're not, where you're being used by God, that's all the more power to you. Do it. That's great. That just makes you extremely versatile. But where the unhealthy part comes is when they say, no, you can't do it that way, you must be this. And they're not ready to be that. That's where it becomes that, in the sociological terms, they call it covering. Because you have to pretend like you're somebody you're not and just go along because your culture's forcing you to do it. So, remember this. This is where it's like you look back across and you're the high planner and you see the guy not planning or the person that's just, oh, we'll figure it out. And you're just thinking, you're so irresponsible. And then the other person's looking at you going, but you're so inflexible. And then it starts becoming moral issues of sin, right? And my encouragement to you is be very careful about moralizing a perspective you do not understand. Okay, if it's not your strength, you don't do it that way, don't say it's right or wrong, because more than likely, you're going to be wrong. Every single time, right? Now, what's interesting is the first time you see that picture, you're absolutely certain the prince is flipping you off, right? And it just makes you madder, and you're more right, and you are absolutely convinced that person is more wrong until you make the effort to come around and see their other perspective. And that happens so many times in the church. So your job is again, to keep providing understanding to the people that you know don't understand the perspective. So if you hear a comment from somebody that says, it befuddles me, how do you get this person to do this? I can't get them to do squat. That means they don't understand that person. They can't understand how to motivate that person. They can't understand how to inspire the person to want to work with them. And it's all about not what you say, but what? How you say it. And on and on and on it goes. All right, next one. We gotta keep moving. Competitive cooperative. I'm surprised there's not more competitive people in the room. And you guys are very much, mid on the cooperative side. So that's a great thing. You're going to work really well together. But what do you think as a group, what are the pitfalls? Because the most competitive person in the room, who's about that 75 in that? Okay, so, and what's your name?
Abby.
Abby and?
John.
John, okay. So you guys aren't super competitive. You lean competitive, right? So what if Eric says, hey, small groups are doing this, and is everybody just going to say, okay? But what if John and Abby, if they're like, well, maybe we should think about doing something else. Could we try to, could we maybe try to do twice as many groups? Because sometimes it takes the assertive, achievement-oriented people to set the goal, And they said, hey, let's try to increase the number of small groups by 2 next year. And then it's like, no, let's make it 20. You know, I mean, so where are those people in the room? And it's almost a missing voice, right? Because normally you don't have trouble finding competitive people on a team. And it may be, again, like how competitive would you guys consider yourself? Is that pretty accurate, where you are on the scale?
I'm competitive against myself.
Yeah.
If I am outwardly mean to others about it, I think it's with myself.
Right.
Push myself.
And think about that, because that is so important. Look at who's on the domestic cluster, who's the most competitive, the Caucasians and the Asians. But like my dad was exactly like Abby. He was not going to compete with you head on. But you know what he did? He was extremely competitive in the stock market. He would work and compete. You know, he knew it was a zero-sum game. If he was going to win, everybody else was going to lose, and he was going to work as hard as he could. He was so driven. But when it came to playing golf or standing up to somebody and competing head-to-head, he wouldn't do it. It's a different kind of competition. So even defining what competition is and how you're going to compete is very important. Because you do need really competitive people on teams who can assert themselves and achieve and push everybody to accomplish everything God said. Just imagine if Paul had been like, hey, Paul, I'm going to send you out to reach all these unreached people. And it's like, okay, well, if it gets, maybe I'll do a couple of them. So you need people out there that are going to help drive everybody forward. And notice what I say here is are we missional or relational? And you need them both. Now, what's important, though, is that you can accomplish the mission and bring people along with you. Okay? Because on the cooperative side, you got a lot of cooperatives here, and you guys are really good at drawing a crowd, right? And that's why you're really good small group leaders. People love gathering around you, and they love just interacting with you. And the question is, though, can you move that group somewhere? Or is it one of those groups that's just going to meet for 20 years, week after week after week, and they don't ever want to split, they don't ever want to do anything other than, no, let's just meet. Well, why are we meeting? We're just encouraging each other. There's a place for that, right? But at some point, can you accomplish more than just meeting? What we always say at Mosaix is you need to be 3 things all at the same time. You need to be missional, you need to be relational, and you need to be spiritual. All 3, all together. You can have strengths in one or the other, but you can't not have, you can't leave one of those blank, for sure. That leads to a disaster. So our staff values, we want everybody to know how to accomplish a mission. We want them to gather people and know how to gather people relationally. And we want them to be spiritually apprised of how that group is going. And then we surround that with a lot of other things, which I won't get into now. This one is very, very important, and it's probably, it's the one you agree on all the most, which is your all long term, right? And this is very, very much a picture of the American church. The only thing that's slower than the church is higher level Christian ed. They're like in the 90s slow typically when I assess those executive teams. But you guys are pretty high. You're an 86 overall, which means you're really long term. So, just talking to your people last night about how long change takes to happen here at Vintage. it takes that long. You know, so it shouldn't surprise you that you're having to wait 10 years, 12 years, 14 years in some cases, right? Because that's just the pace of the culture here. Who here is kind of like in the 59? Okay, so what's the most frustrating thing about being more short-term oriented in a place that's longer term?
I mean, I'm still pretty far on the long term, I guess.
Yeah.
I think when I want things to happen faster, and I'm not part of the conversation of like it happening, you know? So I'm sitting over here being like, why don't they just do it?
Yeah.
Well, there's some things like you can be, if you are part of it directly, you can be like, okay, well, I'm just going to do it myself and get it done now, but that's not how it always works. Sometimes it's not something you can really do personally. You have to wait for someone else to do it. And so, yeah, it can be frustrating.
Yeah, it can be, right? And this is where, especially when it comes to issues such as race in the church, all these things that are happening, because many times the churches are just slow, right? I mean, think about it. Especially the mega churches today, you have multiple campuses, you're streaming out, the service is timed to the second, the services are planned weeks in advance, they're not on the back of a napkin 30 minutes before, and so if something happens on Thursday that's traumatic and that needs to be addressed on Sunday, you know, sometimes there are people waiting to be comforted, ministered to, when stuff like that happens. It affects them deeply and profoundly. But if you called Thursday night and said, hey, this just happened, shouldn't we address this on Sunday? Somebody's going to say, well, that order's already set. We could maybe get that in 2 or 3 weeks. You know? And so then it doesn't get addressed because of the logistical nature of who you are organizationally, and then the people that are waiting to be ministered to in that moment just go, wait a minute, don't you even care about this issue? You know, and so that's the way it kind of plays out many times, and a lot of times it's a good excuse for churches because churches don't even know how to address those very difficult, sensitive, race-oriented issues, and so they just don't say anything. And that comes across just as loudly as not caring. And so, you know, who usually the most frustrated in these kinds of cases, especially short-term people? It's because on boards, when I do boards, most of the time, a lot of the boards are comprised of business people. They're the 90-day people. They're like, I don't understand why I can get results in 90 days. I have to report every 90 days to my shareholders. Why can't we work faster than this? You know, it drives those people crazy, right? So, yes.
But like just looking at my numbers, literally the 90 on the long term, but when it came to low uncertainty of avoidance versus high uncertainty of avoidance, you would think that those would be more aligned, right? Because they're very similar in action or lack of action.
Yeah, they're not correlated.
Okay.
None of these are really correlated, but they do intersect. Okay? So you can be long-term and you can be both. Right. You can be either or on any of the other ones. And all you got to do is just think of good examples of people you know. Because there's plenty of long-term people. I'm long-term, very long-term. Remember, it took my people 1,000 years to build a wall. And so, and I was always a long-term thinker at Mosaix in those early days. I would always just say, you know, it took my people 1,000 years to build a wall. It's going to take us longer than 10 years to build a church. And that's a very healthy perspective in some cases. But when your lease is up and you got to move across the street in 30 days, you don't want me to be the one in charge. Right? We'd still be moving if that were the case. But you can think, all of these are like, there's ways. You think about like, can you be both collectivistic and competitive? Well, the answer is yes. Think every team that wins a national championship. They're collectivistic and highly competitive. But it's just defining who you're going to compete with, and those kinds of things, that be the one to define all those aspects of every one of the values, and you'll find ways to harness people. The whole point of all of this is where you can understand people so well that you can almost predict how they're going to respond under duress, how they're going to respond in the midst of conflict, how they're going to respond, if you're having to wait for something. All of these different kinds of things. You want to know how to motivate them, inspire them, how to correct them, how to resolve conflict with them. And that's all this is. It's just giving you tools to help build the kingdom. But it can greatly be used in your workplace. All right. Let's do this one where we stand. Okay, this is a very, very important one. This is, how much do others have to interpret what's not said? This is direct, indirect. Why this is so important is because this is one of two values that greatly influence the way you're going to resolve conflict. All right, so let's stand and have the indirect people over here, the direct people on this side, and everybody in the middle here. How far off to the right are you? Are you about like right? You're about right here? Okay. So we're missing the 92. All right. So we're missing our person, our outlier today. There's no 92 over there. The closest thing we got is, tell me your name again. Is it Mark? Matt, okay. And Matt is just on the other side. He says he's about like right here. Okay.
So I think that was Lamar.
Yeah, I remember. We know it was because he was at the staff meeting the day before we did this. Do you want to tell who it is? He probably wouldn't care.
He's here today.
Oh.
He must have maybe ran to the.
Oh, he was outside.
Oh, the outside.
You and I were talking to him.
Oh, okay.
There is the one.
Yeah. Okay, so notice you guys are about on average right here. Okay, that's pretty direct. You lean direct, and in actuality, good teams do lean direct. So what does it mean when you're indirect? Well, look at what it says at the bottom on the right screen. You talk all around the point, but you never really get to it. Whereas the people on the far end, you never have to worry about what they're trying to say because they say it. Okay? The people on this end are like, sometimes when you leave the conversation, it's like, what were they trying to tell me?
So what are we? What do we do?
Yeah, so the one
I find myself in the middle on almost all of these.
yeah, that's actually a great place to be.
Because you can change based on the situation.
So let me ask you something. Do you, when like you talk to people that are indirect, do you usually know when they're not being direct with you?
Yes.
Yeah. to people in the direct side, they're usually like, what was that all about? But at least you know, okay, I know I'm not getting something. How can I get it? Yes.
I feel like, especially in my work context, I do a lot of like interpreting between the two groups. Like somebody will be over here like talking, and then somebody will say something, and I'll say, well, what they meant was this, and like liaison.
Yeah.
Be the interpreter.
That's a very, very strong role for the people in the middle. They're interpreting for both sides. Because there's some people, like I was asking, Lamar's the one who was all the way over there because he was here on Thursday and he was the one, he was by himself out there. And I just said, hey, Lamar, are you the kind that can walk in the room and immediately know where the emotion is in the room? And he was like, absolutely. I know there's tension in the room. I can walk in and go, I don't know what was going on in there, but man, the tension was so thick you could cut a knife. And the people on that side, that's a superpower, right? They have no idea like what's happening in the room in the moment because they're so direct and everything they're used to saying is, hey, you just say what needs to be said in the moment. So where does the conflict happen?
Feelings could get hurt easily. Maybe if you're more on an indirect side and someone's being direct, and you could take it more personally or have your feelings hurt versus a direct person, maybe like, what are they trying to hide by talking around what we need to actually talk about?
Yeah, and you can see there's suspicion that arises just from the fact that you're not being honest with me. But many times they're not being honest because they don't want to hurt your feelings, or they're conscious of who's in the room. And so this is all that perfect balance between what needs to be said versus how it needs to be said. Okay? So the people over here are a lot more concerned about, no, this needs to be said, and I'm going to say it. And how many times do we need that to happen? Not all the time, right? But sometimes people need to be the one that says, you know, we have got to stop messing with this. That was unacceptable. Who's responsible for this? Let's figure a way for this never happen again. And everybody's like, oh, thank God you said that. But then there's other times where it's like, no, we need to be more careful about the way we say things depending on who's in the room and the moment. That's like the difference between truth and grace, right? And understanding sometimes things need to be said, sometimes you need to wait and say, oh, maybe I should wait until there's a better time. You know, this is where the whole conflict thing comes into place, because if you try to resolve conflict in a crowded room, the indirects are never going to be involved in that. They're just not going to say what needs to be said, and especially in a moment of conflict. Okay? So, how do you get the most out of the indirects? When would you be willing to be more direct and honest about what you're thinking?
For me, it's not about being honest, it's about being aware of the larger context and how things are received. Like you can be very honest and so we'll see. I'm being indirect, right? You can be forthright without being blunt.
Say that one more time.
You can be forthright without being blunt. And approach things in a way, in a teachable moment.
Yeah, so notice how much consideration there is for when he's going to be forthright, that he's thinking about, can this be a teachable moment? Whereas people over here are not thinking about the teachable moment, right? They're more concerned with, no, I need to say this because this is important. What were you going to say, Shiro?
I was going to say that the difference between honest and direct, like it's not
necessarily being direct is being honest,
Mm-hmm.
and being indirect, I don't think it's necessarily being dishonest.
Right, that is
I
true.
think it's, like what you said is, I never think of that I'm being dishonest,
Mhm.
but I'm being thoughtful of
Mhm.
how it needs to be said, and maybe thinking further. I think it's a, the long-term thing is that if I say this right here, right now, what's that going to mean? So, like, like you say, maybe the middle is this, I might need to wait out a bit, or maybe till tomorrow. Right now, you've just got some other news, So I think it's more of thinking all around than just it has to be said. It has to be said now.
Yes, right. So much of indirectness is not about what it's said, but when it's said. So if you really want to get an indirect person to be more upfront about the way they're really feeling, then one of the most important questions is it the right time? Lamar, just in time. We're right where we were Thursday. Yes.
I think where this is challenging, and Lamar could probably speak to this, is my husband would be on the other side of Lamar. And I think where it's not about the communication as much as it's the listening.
Yeah.
So when you're in a relationship, when you're married to someone who's that far on that side, and I would have thought I would have been closer to that side than in the middle. It's the listening part, because I'm like, I know you're trying to say something, but you're thinking of your emotions, my emotions, your cousin's emotions, your uncle's emotions, your mama's emotions, and your dead grandma's emotions, and just tell me what you want to say. And so instead it's more like, I understand the indirect because you're so aware and so conscious of the environment in which you're engaging and speaking. But for someone like myself, I'm just like,
Yeah.
get it out, like just say it. But you have to be patient, and that patience can be very challenging, especially when you're in a discussion with your husband about an important topic.
Right. So much.
Ever.
I mean, there's so much wisdom in that, right? Because so much of this ultimately involves time, right? Can I be willing to wait until the right time? Be patient with somebody enough to where I can actually hear what they really need to tell me. Yes.
I think the illustration is really helpful. And to me, that just looks like thinking out loud and like whether or not you can follow someone's thought process to where they get to the point. And that's where I was saying I think I end up being the translator.
Mm-hmm.
Because also I work with children who don't speak English as their first language, so I'm used to like following the maze of their thoughts. And so like when somebody is in our group having a discussion, like thinking out loud about like deep spiritual things and their thoughts are going all over the place, I can usually like follow their line of thought and then restate it where other people are like, what did you just say? And like being able to take what the indirect like mumble jumble and like put it into a concise statement.
Very good. Yes. So use those skills, to bring clarity, to bring unity, to bring understanding from the people that are not understanding one another. What were somebody's going to say?
I was going to ask a question. So
Yeah.
what I'm hearing is accommodations.
Mm-hmm.
How can directs be more accommodating to indirects? I'm wondering what are some ways that indirects can be more accommodating to directs?
Yeah. Well, definitely, I would say to the directs, where you are as an average. So the research has shown diverse teams have to lean direct in order to function. So at some point, the indirects are going to have to be uncomfortable in saying what needs to be said. Now, they can still be very gracious around the way they say it, but the main point needs to be clearer, and they need to talk more directly about what they're feeling and thinking, okay? if they're going to be on any kind of team that has implications with a lot of people, because you just cannot lead people indirectly. It just leads to, it's too much confusion. However, there's plenty of people out there that are indirect, and that's where the indirects are really, really good, because they know how to read other indirects, they know what they're trying to say, and when you're moving on because you didn't understand, they're like, wait a minute, you need to hear me, because this is what was just said in that meeting. Yeah.
I think it also has to do with your comfort level. Like, I think when I'm around people that I'm very comfortable with, I'm way more direct, because I think they know my intentions and they know my heart, versus when I'm around people that I don't know, if it's a larger group, I can be indirect because I don't know everybody's intentions, and I don't know their beliefs. So I think it can also really depend on the context that you're in and the comfort level also.
Trust is a big, big factor, right? And that does not come apart from relationship. So remember, there's two ways to approach leadership. If you approach it purely from the missional side, where you're always trying to accomplish the mission, and you don't really care about the relational side, eventually you'll be on your own, because people won't trust you enough anyway to go with you. And so in many parts of the world, the most predominant style of leadership is from the relational end. If you want to know where, like, go to Central and South America. All the leaders in the room, you know, I do this in manufacturing. In America, 80% of the managers and supervisors are lion personalities. They're very direct. They know how to get the job done. They'll cuss you out if you don't do what you're supposed to be doing. But when you go and do the same kind of testing in Mexico, everybody's the golden retriever personality type, where they build relationships first. And so the important thing is, as you lead, especially diverse others, just recognize there's so many that won't trust you, won't speak you know, about the way they're really feeling, until there is trust built. And that just takes time. I was talking to the president of this international ministry, who, I was telling this to the Thursday group, he went to Southeast Asia to meet with his leader there, and he said the Southeast Asia office had a lot of issues with it, and he could not get the leader to tell him what the real issue was. And he said, I knew she wasn't being honest. He was about right here. He's like, I recognized she was being indirect with me, but I couldn't get it out of her. And so I just extended my trip. And I kept taking her to dinner, and I kept building a relationship with her. And it wasn't until like the 7th day that she was willing to tell me what was really going on. And she was sitting in the room, and I said, why did it take so long? And she goes, well, in my world, that wasn't long. That's just building a relationship. Yes.
So you said a lot of these are not collaborative, but they intersect. So a lot of us are long-term planners, but we're also more on the direct side. How does that, I mean, does that correlate at all, or?
Yeah, remember, none of them are necessarily correlated, but there'll be plenty of instances where it's just like combinations of things. So you can be high planning, you can be super direct or indirect, and be a good planner, you know. And so just to remember, just try to think of all those different examples, and don't confuse the two. Just because you're this means you should be one of the others, because they're uncorrelated, they're not connected.
I often think emotion gets confused as well with direct versus indirect, where indirect can perceive someone who is more direct as lacking the emotion during those types of conversations. When it's not emotion, it has nothing to do with emotion, and I think that kind of confused.
What is it?
It's passion.
Yeah, a lot of times direct people are just the most passionate people in the room, right? And it's not about necessarily emotion, or not because they don't care as much as It just is the way they're trying to get the point across. They just don't want there to be any ambiguity, you know? And so really, but the point is that you can't always be that direct in every situation, and the direct people have learned that the hard way at times, right?
I was going to say, I think what Abby hit on was relational, because being a direct person, I've met people who in one interaction will say, I mean, I don't know, you know, Angel's direct, you know, she's very, you know, she's to the point, matter of fact. And then that same person, after going to lunch, after hanging out with me and my family, after us grabbing coffee, having a meal together, it's like, you know, I'm relational, I'm, you know, understanding, I'm compassionate, you know, all these different things come into play when trust is built and there's relationship being built. So I think that that's a key point is you can't really just judge the person based off we have to be aware of how we interact with people, because we might not get a second chance when people are coming through our doors.
Mm-hmm.
Like that might be the only time. So we always have to be aware of how we're speaking, how we're communicating, but also if we have a second opportunity or the third opportunity to build relationship with folk, that's when you really begin to build that trust and really get to know people and see them for more than what that first interaction is.
Yeah.
I was surprised to see myself on this end of the spectrum, and I think if I think back to my attitude when I was taking the assessment, I was thinking professional, right? Peers, professional peers, and a lot of this is learned behavior, but as we're talking about it, for me, I like to think that I flex a little bit on this spectrum because it's situational. It's who I'm talking to, what's the situation like. And when I took it, I'm like, okay, American Western business culture, you know, if I'm reporting up to the board of directors, I'm going to be super concise. I'm going to be telling them just what they want to hear. But if I'm with an international customer or in a different country, I'm going to be much more aware of how I'm presenting myself, what that body language is, what that tone is, what the behavior is. But even like if I'm talking to a team member, I try to understand how they communicate, right? If I have recognized over getting to know them that they are direct, I'm not going to dance around. But then if I have somebody who is like, I've got to lay out, I've got to set the stage, right? I got to get the context, so before I convey this message, it's going to be well received. And so, I don't know, I find myself all over all these descriptions people have given, like, I've done that, just depending on who I'm talking to or what the situation is.
And it is Dan, right?
Yeah.
So what Dan just described is high cultural capability under the action score. Because that means he's aware in the moment how direct he is, whether or not the people in the room are indirect or indirect. He's reading body language, facial expressions. He's managing his tone and tenor as he speaks. He knows what the people are expecting and the way he is communicating towards them. That's an extremely important skill, and that's the one that this group needs to improve in the most. So Dan's the leader on that one.
That's a little more indirect.
He just volunteered to train you all on that part of the thing, because that's almost a soft skill, right? That just takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of metacognitive kind of analysis of the way you think and the way you're interacting. You almost have to move yourself out of the room and look at it as a third-party observer about the way you interact and the way others are interacting with you. All right, if I don't get done, we're going to be here a lot longer than 12. Why don't we, let me do these last few, and then we'll take a little break, and then I'll put you into a group discussion. All right, so go ahead and have a seat.